The International Monetary Fund says global debt has increased to $164 trillion, more than it was at the height of the financial crisis a decade ago.
This bubble is deeply systemic.
Volatility like we've never seen before.
We're going to have a recession when rates normalize. And if you think otherwise, you're delusional.
I think we're in the biggest bubble ever experienced.
It feels to me like we are very close to the end of that bubble.
The debt is much higher now. In 2008, the Chinese had a lot of money saved for a rainy day, and they started spending it when it rained. Even the Chinese have a lot of debt now. So there's nobody left to save us.
That's the everything bubble. There's no place to hide this time.
Everywhere you look in the United States, it's awash with debt. The government debt under President Trump is out of control. Students are up to their ears in debt. And corporate America is the most highly leveraged it's ever been.
What we're seeing is a massive, they said in April marked the third straight month of falling orders for business equipment. It's the lowest in 5 years, $62 billion. Corporations are using the money for short-term purposes. A wide gap exists between a handful of ultra-rich companies and the rest of corporate America. For the most part, corporate companies aren't pouring the money they borrow into capital expenditures to increase efficiency and capacity. See, it used to be companies borrowed money to grow.
Corporate America is more highly leveraged today than it was in 2007. And in the US bond markets, there's $3 trillion of corporate debt sitting at BBB. Now, the US high yield market is only $1 trillion. If some of these very highly leveraged BBB names are faced with an economic slowdown and their business models go kaput, then they're going to start sliding into BB territory.
You just can't keep printing money. Yeah, so, and we're blowing into this huge bubble right now. So everything looks good, you know. When you blow the economy, it's called bubblenomics, not economics. And it's bubblenomics. You blow the economy into a bubble, you have high real estate prices, high stock prices, high education costs, and everything looks good, except people are getting poorer.
The whole society is on a speeding train. The train is roaring down the track. It's already visible that there's a stone wall that the track goes right into, and that if you don't do something, this fast train that we're all on is going to hit that wall. And everybody knows it, but they're having such a good time. The cocktails taste so good that nobody does anything, even though in the cocktail conversation, they talk to each other about the train and the wall.
When the economy starts to slow, the first thing they do is reduce interest rates. And in a recession, that'll generally fix it. So it's like take an aspirin and go home tomorrow, so they reduce interest rates. Well, that didn't work. So then they went to quantitative easing, which is printing money, basically. And that was Bernanke and those guys. That didn't work. So the economy continued down. And finally, it stayed down for 10 years. That's a depression. It's not a recession. And so as it's coming up right now, it's not lifting. It's lifting for the rich. You know, the gap between the rich and everybody else is getting bigger. But unfortunately, you know, the rest of the human race is suffering.
I'm beginning to wonder, this could maybe be the death throw. Watching the British destroy themselves around Brexit, watching this country not only elect a Trump, but continue enough support that he can continue being in the naughty boy position and behaving outrageously. I think these are signs of social disaffection. Clearly, the splitting of our country intellectually and ideologically, the polarization, particularly on the right.
We know the story about wage growth. We know the story that these asset price rises haven't filtered through to the masses. So we've seen a lot of the political ramifications of that already, whether it's the US election or the French election or Brexit. You could argue the Eurozone is being held together at the moment, but you know, what happens if the Eurozone goes into recession? What happens to the periphery there? So I think the real risk is in a recession that you get more extreme politics. People be wanting to take assets off people. which is a danger. But again, in the UK, we had a lot of people suggesting that at the last election. So I think a recession at this point, where a lot of the population has not enjoyed the fruits of a recovery, I think is a very precarious place to be.
The government keeps saying, for the obvious self-promoting reasons.
Or self-preserving reasons.
Right, recovery. The word recovery appears 10 times a day in the mass media. This is a kind of torture, because you're telling the people there's a recovery, but they're not experiencing it. So the next step, because we've been trained, is to blame yourself. You must be doing something wrong that you aren't participating in what everybody says is the big recovery, because your job is no good. You had to substitute for your old job, which had an income and security and benefits, a new one where you're a greeter at Walmart, don't know 1 week from the next what hours you're going to work, what kind of work you're going to do. The modern economy with its euphemistic gig or shared economy is no substitute for the reality, as Americans like to say, that there's too much month at the end of the money.
The very sad truth is income inequality is the highest it's been since 1929-30. There's a reason for that. We can go into that on another day, another time, but it's real. And the point you make about the average person doesn't have much savings. 40% of people in America couldn't come up with $500 for an emergency. I mean, that's a frightening thought. The average person around the world has no margin of safety. And I think that's why you see the risk of, civil unrest, and potentially even warfare rises, because when people get desperate, they do really desperate things. And it doesn't take much to push us into a pretty significant downturn that would be exacerbated by demographics and debt and deflation to cause some real desperation.
People are discovering that American dream is out of reach. There's no hope you're going to get it. There's no sign that the downturn, which really hit home in 2008, is ever going away.
But ever since Reagan came to town and brainwashed everyone into believing that government is the problem, not the solution, we've gutted regulations, busted unions, and as a result, returned capitalism to something resembling its natural, brutish state.
Yeah, the only people who've made money in the last 10 years are the 1% of the 1%, the elite who hold equities. And of course, we have this huge bubble in the stock market, and 99.9% of the population have been left behind.
The next correction, the next recession, the next financial problem are going to be the worst in my lifetime, worst in your lifetime. America's the largest debtor nation in the history of the world. Many states, many pension funds are essentially underwater. So when you start having more problems, who's going to bail us out? Who's going to bail out the Illinois pension fund? Illinois cannot bail it out. People are leaving Illinois as fast as they can because they realize that they cannot pay the taxes.
The problem is the liabilities. The liabilities of the US government now are over $124 trillion. Now, what does that mean to the man in the street? What that means is that US government has promised to pay people for healthcare, for unemployment, for social security, for whatever it is. They've made promises to pay people $124 trillion. But they haven't funded it. That's why it's an unfunded liability. Where the hell is the US government going to get $124 trillion from? There is no way on earth that they can pay this money to the people to whom they owe it in terms of a currency that is worth much more than toilet paper. It just cannot be done. And that's the problem. And then you're going to get a fight in the United States over who gets the claims on the US government that they can pay. And that means you probably break down into civil war. And frankly, it's almost like civil war is breaking out in America at the moment.
We have a tiny minority of people, the owners of the enterprise, the board of directors, the major shareholders, whatever you call them, and they have all the power. They decide what the enterprise produces, they decide what technology is used, they decide physically and geographically where the production is, and then most important, They alone decide what to do with the profits that everybody has helped to produce. This is not democratic. This is not egalitarian. This is an autocracy, a dictatorship of a tiny group of people.
If you think about what Western central banks have done over the last decade, since the global financial crisis, is they've been playing whack-a-mole with volatility. Every time volatility has spiked up, they've managed to hit it on the head by some combination of cutting interest rates and or printing money. And my worry basically is this. It is that if we have another spike up in volatility, can the banks still pay whack-a-mole? And I worry that they can't, because I think we're at the end of the game. Because if they do come out with another bout of QE, then banks are going to go bust. Pension funds are going to go bust. Insurance companies are going to go bust. And if it pushes the stock market back up again, then the 99.9% are probably not going to tolerate more handouts to the 0.1%. So that leads to social and political instability. And so maybe we are at the point where the West finally has to take its medicine. And then we really are on the top of the roller coaster looking down.
So if we have a setback right now, the question is it recession or depression? Can we recover? Because as they keep saying, with interest rates so low, that's what it means. They can't manipulate the economy anymore. That's all it means to me. So if we go into a depression and that doesn't work, do we go, what's after a depression is collapse.
Inequality is now at a record high, and the richest 3% of the population now controls more than half of all the wealth. Middle-class incomes, meanwhile, are stagnant. And as if that wasn't bad enough, the child poverty rate right here in the United States is now among the worst in the entire developed world.
You know, in a society that had been deprived of these things a long time, this might all be absorbed as the way the world is. But American capitalism, from the end of World War II to the present, built its own defense on the notion we produce a big middle class, and we raise your wages, and now this is all being taken away. That's a very different experience if you had it and if you were led to expect it because your parents promised you the American dream and you're getting the American not so dreamy. The reaction becomes easier for you to break from something and to see the break as not your fault of not conforming, but the failure of a promise, which is what it is.